Many of us grew up in the city of Detroit, love its neighborhoods, whether east or west of Woodward, take loops around Belle Isle, walk our magnificent bridge-to-bridge Detroit Riverwalk, support Lions, Pistons, Wings, and Tigers, attend performances of Detroit Opera House and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and visit the Detroit Institute of Arts, one of the top 6 museums in the United States. Many of those in this room are or have been DIA docents. Some here tonight may even have seen the current 7 Mile and Livernois exhibit at the DIA. Tonight we will hear the dramatic inside story of how Detroit was rescued from the brink of oblivion and how the DIA's significant art collection, now valued in billions, was saved. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a time at the end of the conversation for questions. Please use the note cards that are in your program to write them and pass them along to the side for ushers to collect when we get into the Q&A session. But now, please help me welcome former U.S. District Court Judge Jerry Rosen and Guy Gordon.
Thank you. We should thank the Village Club. Lovely dinner.
It's on my list.
Okay, good. We should thank them for giving our wives a handy window to jump out of if this should go badly. That's very nice of them.
My wife has heard this story many times. I don't know if Gail has.
She'll be going to Gail. Wait for it. For those of you that are here, to her point, how many of you are lifelong Detroiters?
Great.
How many of you are transplants who may have arrived in the last 40 years? Okay, I'm one of those. How many of you believed 12 years ago that we would see our city in the position that it is in now?
We have one over here.
There's an optimist. Where there's manure, there's got to be a pony. There's an optimist in every room. Nobody could have conceived 12 years ago the journey that this city would take. And they say the first, any journey begins with a first step. This was the first step. And it was July 18th, 2013.
4:06 p.m. when the petition was filed.
Thank you, Rain Man.
Sparkly, very sparkly.
Well, it was a huge moment in your life.
It was.
And we're going to get to that in a moment. But I think it's important. So many things have happened, so many wonderful things have happened, from the draft to the Hudson's building to the rebirth of Belle Isle. This incredible resurgence in Renaissance. We were the Renaissance city, and it was one of the greatest fraudulent monikers ever. Now we truly can lay claim to that. And it all started with the grand bargain. But let's remind people of where we were 12 years ago. 40% of the streetlights in the city of Detroit didn't light.
I can cross that off my list.
Well, no, but you can add to the fact that, it wasn't just because the bulbs burned out.
It wasn't. They'd been scavenged.
Yeah, the copper innards had been literally stripped from them. So this wasn't a matter of just changing a bulb.
No.
40%. Now imagine if you live down that street, how that impacts your life. What was the response time for the Detroit Police Department?
It was an hour. The national average was just under 11 minutes. Response time for the police was close to an hour.
There was a cycle here in Detroit that began in the 60s, which was when people moved out and revenues fell, you just raised taxes. We were pretty much taxed to the limit, and we also were leveraged. Were we leveraged to the limit or beyond the limit?
Guy, it was a death spiral. We were already at our statutory borrowing limit, so we couldn't borrow anymore. Despite the fact that we had the highest taxes in the state and one of the very highest taxes of any city in the country, they were still talking about raising taxes to pay the pension debt and other indebtedness that was accruing. The pensions were more than $3.5 billion underfunded, and that was conservatively stated. The health care for the retirees was almost $6 billion underfunded and growing. And they continued to talk about tax increases. The population guy, and anybody here who remembers being in Detroit from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s will remember that Detroit was the fourth highest population in the country. We were at almost 2 million people. By the time of the filing of the bankruptcy in July of 2013, we were under 700,000 people. It was the greatest population loss that any major city had experienced in American history.
And in spite of all these tax
People were voting
increases-
with their feet.
Yeah, and it wasn't, we talk a lot about white flight in the 60s and 70s. By the time I got here in the mid-80s, it was no longer white flight, it was green flight. Anybody with money that could afford it left. The revenues, City of Detroit total revenues, over the 50 years before the bankruptcy dropped by 40%. In the 5 years, half of that occurred. A 20% revenue drop in the 5 years before the bankruptcy.
And it was projected to accelerate to twice that over the next 5 years.
Right, the cash flow was something like a $200 million.
$200 million a loss. You know, I could go on and talk about the numbers. They're pretty depressing. You know, Guy, there's really two parts to Detroit's dysfunction as a city. One is the financial part, and we can talk more about that. More than $18 billion in debt, really much more than that because that was a conservatively stated number, and there was some fuzzy math to get to 18 billion. It was really much more than that. The pensions, as I said, were $3.5 billion underfunded.
With some really dubious investments.
Really dubious investments. Not just the investments, but the way they calculated the pension underfunding was goofy. The city had stopped making contributions to the pensions funds. About 3 months before the filing of the bankruptcy, the city was no longer funding the pensions. The retiree health care was $6 billion underfunded, and really more than that. A third of the budget was going to pay legacy benefits, retiree benefits, whether pensions or health care, and that was projected to go up to 45% over the next 5 years. Totally unsustainable. If a city is paying 45% of all of its revenues to support its retirees, that is simply unsustainable. The city had less than 8 weeks of operating cash on hand. The credit rating, city's credit rating was at junk status and falling, so it really couldn't borrow. I didn't know you could fall below junk status, but you could. There was a $162 million cash flow shortage. And revenues, as you said, revenues had fallen 20% in just 5 years.
But anecdotally.
And the tax base had disappeared, and expenses were increasing at an extrapolative rate.
But there are moments when you look at things that were happening in Detroit at the time that were anecdotal. They were true. One of them involves a Coke can. And because we talked about this, because this was the moment as a journalist when I heard this story. I had heard it from a colleague. And I said, well, we truly now are a third world city.
But you got to context it. There were 12,000 fires a year in the city. And I should say, let me put a pin in this and just say, you know, people often ask me, how the hell did Detroit get into bankruptcy? There's a great line from Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, in which one of the main characters is asked, he had gone into bankruptcy, and he's asked, how the hell did you end up in bankruptcy? And he says, 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. And that's exactly what happened to Detroit. And there's really 2 parts to it. One is the financial part that we've been talking about. The other really and more heartbreaking part is the quality of life.
And the quality of services.
And the quality of services. There's an antiseptic term that municipal bankruptcy experts use. Service delivery insolvent. Think about that. Service delivery insolvent. What it really means is the city is no longer a city at all. The population decline we talked about, 2 million to under 700,000. Police response time was an hour. The national average was 11 minutes. 40% of the lights were out, and the copper wire innards that were necessary to fix them had been scavenged. The police and firefighters didn't have a contract. So they would train in Detroit and then go to the suburbs where they could make twice as much money.
And the suburbs loved this.
And the suburbs loved
They
it.
could poach quality people that were highly trained.
Yeah, Detroit was the minor league system for
Yeah.
Troy and Southfield and the other suburbs. There were 150,000 blighted homes and vacant properties. As I said, 12,000 fires a year. Garbage wasn't being picked up. Snow wasn't being plowed.
But get to the Coke can.
And I'll get to the Coke can.
This is the quintessential.
But before you get to the Coke can, you got to talk about the water system, which was springing floods with regularity and had $6 billion in debt, and there was no money. It was not possible to revitalize and rebuild the water and sewer system.
Well, they opened them up, and the mains were still built out of wood.
Wood, yeah. During the bankruptcy, I was going out to a meeting in Southfield, and I got caught in one of these broken mains in a flood. I was 40 minutes late. So let's talk about the Coke can.
Because this crystallizes it.
The fire department had no funds for alarm systems, if you can believe this. So what these creative firefighters did was they rigged up a Coke can that they filled with coins. They put it on the fax machines because the notices of the fires would come in on the fax machine. And when the notices came in on the fax machine, they would kind of rumble and they would tip the Coke can over. And that's how they learned that there was a fire.
So if your home is on fire, truly in God we trust, in the coins that were in the Coke can that were sitting on the fax machine.
Yeah.
That was where we were. The other thing that I noticed was in station after station that I would visit, the tankers, the engine
Right.
companies, the water tankers that would be sent first so that they would have water on hand before they could hook up. Well, they were leaking so much water, everybody in every fire station had a garden hose going in the top of the fire truck to compensate for the water that was spilling out from the bottom of the fire truck. So the first thing that the guys did when the Coke can fell over was they would run out, get their gear on, and then the last thing that they would do is pull the garden hose out of the truck so that when they got to the fire, they could be reasonably assured that they would arrive with at least 90% of the water that they needed.
Yeah. You really can't, it's hard to believe that a city, a major city, that was once the arsenal of democracy, one of the most productive, from a manufacturing perspective, most productive cities in the world, could have sunk so low. It's really hard to believe. When I first got into the bankruptcy, I had our court librarian put together some reading for me. And I took it down to Florida. I was on a golf trip with our 15-year-old son. And I would get up early and start reading it, and it was just beyond depressing. You know, I lived in Detroit, so I knew things were bad, but I had no idea that they were this bad.
So we are living right now in the epilogue of Jerry's book. I mean, we've seen what's happened, the miracle. In a non-biblical Detroit context, this is the greatest story ever told. So understanding, we know where we are. Let's take you back to the beginning. We've done that. Now, Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest in American history. What does it actually allow you to do? What is it that would say to us, this is the new beginning? Or is it a new beginning? Or are you just kind of washing the debt, downsizing it to something that is palatable, and then moving on?
So bankruptcies are about washing debt and reordering contracts. That's what bankruptcies are about. It's a sad fact of bankruptcy law that contracts are impaired all the time. That's what happens in bankruptcy. But we did in the bankruptcy, we realized that we needed to do much more in Detroit. It was not enough to simply reorder the debt. It was not enough to simply reduce the debt and move on, because Detroit was so broken that the danger was there would be, we always referred to it as a Chapter 18, another bankruptcy 5 years down the road. So we understood, and when I say we, the mediators, Governor Snyder, Steve Rhodes, who was the judge in the case, Kevin Orr, who was the emergency manager, we all realized two things. One, time was Detroit's enemy. Nothing was going to improve.
And Chapter
with
9
time.
would not be enough.
And Chapter 9 would not be enough. And two, that in addition to reordering the debt and restructuring it, we had to provide a foundation and a scaffolding for the city to rebuild.
So
we all realized it.
You couldn't afford just to treat the symptom.
Right.
You ultimately had to treat the disease, but that's really not part and parcel of what the Chapter 9 code is about. So you had to go beyond the code.
You know, Guy, when I first read the code, when I first got appointed, I was completely unfamiliar with the Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code. I read it. It's about 4 pages. I thought, my God, is that all there is? It's aspirational. It's not prescriptive. It's not a blueprint. And I thought, is that all there is? And when Steve Rhodes and I talked about it, we realized that this wasn't going to be a bankruptcy which could simply wash the debt and reorder it and restructure it. We had to provide a foundation for the city on the other side.
But there was no blueprint for that.
There was no blueprint for that. There was also no money to do it.
So let's get to that. So, you refer in your book, and I've got mine here.
No money and no.
By the way, have you got your copy of The Grand Bargain? Because you should. It's a great read, and the characters in it are great, and we'll delve into more of those. But you refer to it continually in this as I'm going to be very careful with my elocution on this, an assetless bankruptcy.
It was an assetless bankruptcy, which
but we
means
have Belle Isle, we have City Airport, we have Detroit Water and Sewage.
All of those were underwater.
So those were not assets that you could either A, liquidate, privatize, or in any way monetize.
Correct. I thought they might be. I remember reading, Kevin Orr did a proposal for creditors at the very beginning of the bankruptcy. And I took this with me down to Florida to read, and it was depressing to say the least. Because when I got to the section on assets, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Those things that I thought might be an asset, like City Airport.
Right.
City Airport would have taken $600 million.
Just to make it functional.
Just to make it functional. Just to make it functional. The parking system, which we thought we could monetize by selling, was $9 million underwater. Belle Isle was $6 million underwater, plus the governor had started the process of converting it to a state park, which has been terrific. Mm-hmm. But so there was really, the cupboard, as Kevin Orr put it, the cupboard was bare, except for one thing.
And that one thing being?
Gene, would you stand up, please? One of the true heroes of the bankruptcy, Gene Gargaro. Gene was the chairman of the Detroit Institute of Arts. And as Gene will tell you, all the creditors and the city wanted to liquidate it. This was, I thought this would be a terrible idea. Detroit had been cannibalizing its assets to mortgage its future for decades. And where had it gotten us? I thought, I went online, because I wasn't a DIA guy. You know, like every kid in Southeast Michigan, I had, in the Cub Scouts, gone to the DIA, and when I was in grade school, we had taken a field trip to the DIA, but I wasn't a DIA guy. So I didn't know much about it. I went online and I saw that the DIA was drawing between 550,000 and 600,000 people a year to Midtown. and feeding all those little cool stores and restaurants that were there. And I thought that liquidating the DIA would be like dropping a hydrogen bomb in the middle of Detroit. It would have sucked the life out of it. Plus, it would have set off a civil war in Detroit. We would have had years and years and years of entrenched warfare, litigation warfare. And time was Detroit's enemy. Detroit didn't have that amount of time. I felt very strongly, and Steve Rhodes felt very strongly, that time was Detroit's enemy. We had to get to the other side of the bankruptcy as quickly as possible. And to engage in this kind of trench warfare over the DIA, there would have been nothing left of Detroit but dust and legal bills.
But were you certain that you wouldn't win a court fight? I mean, the idea that that the creditors could attach the DIA and liquidate the assets. A lot of those gifts to the DIA at the time had
they were subject to
covenants attached to them,
restrictive covenants saying that the art had to remain in the public domain. But again, Guy, bankruptcy is about impairing contracts. That's what we do in bankruptcy.
But also, if we were to
pensions
fight over the art, it would have extended the time, and that's the one thing
would have
Detroit
gone on
didn't have.
it would have gone on forever.
All right, let's meet the parties, though, that were trying at the time to, at least out of their own desperation, looked at the DIA as an asset that would keep them away from the breadline.
So I understood that, Guy.
Let's understand who the parties are, who the creditors are. Let's take this group of folks over here. They're the retirees for the city of Detroit.
23,000.
23,000 of them. They're making, the non-uniformed folks are making $19,000 a year on your pension. Wow. You're rolling in it.
The civilians.
Yeah. If you're uniformed, police and fire, $32,000. Now this is 2013 dollars. It's probably going to be about 8,000 more now.
But the uniforms didn't get Social Security or Medicare.
Or Medicare. Exactly. That's you. What was Kevin Orr's first plan of adjustment?
He was going to cut the pensions by 37.5%.
Okay.
It would have been devastating.
So another round for these folks over here, because they're feeling pretty distressed, right? Now, over here, we've got the creditors, the people that sold the bonds to keep Detroit afloat time and time again.
Billions and billions of bonds in
Kept
all areas of support for the city.
Kept the wolf away from the door. And their biggest fear is that this could be precedent setting. How much did they stand to lose if you were to determine that the stuff that they thought was secured by a millage wasn't?
So I heard time and time again from the bondholders and their insurers particularly that Detroit was a pimple on the ass of an elephant. One of the bondholders told me, or families of bondholders told me, they only had $6 billion at issue in Detroit. They had close to $1 trillion at issue around the country, and they couldn't afford to settle. They had to fight because they did not want to set a precedent. They had to fight. And these are people, people think about them in the demonstrations and protests we had at the courthouse and around the city. Everybody thought of them as bankers. But these were institutions that had invested hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in the city, including $1.5 billion into the pensions. They were insisting on being paid.
Okay, then over here, we've got the employees in the city of Detroit who hope to someday draw a pension. Some of them were already vested. But
Who didn't have collective bargaining agreements.
And they didn't have CBAs at the time, so they're working without contracts. At some point, they're either going to go out on strike and leave the city high and dry, or they're going to go somewhere else. But at some point, you were going to have a reckoning with them as well.
Yeah, there were the employees.
These were all folks circling above the arc, right?
We could not resolve. It was very important from the beginning. Steve Rhodes and I agreed. We had to get as close as possible to a fully consensual plan of adjustment, a feasible plan that could restructure the debt, but also set a foundation and a scaffolding for Detroit on the other side of the bankruptcy.
So Steve Rhodes is appointed by the chief judge
of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals.
circuit.
I recommended
and you
Steve.
recommended him.
I recommended him.
And you were colleagues, and you thought highly of him. But then someone needs to appoint a chief mediator. How the hell did that fall into your lap? And what were you thinking? You were teaching law. You were chief judge of a very important district court for the federal government. You had a lot on your plate. And I'm sure you had Lori chirping in your ear saying, your plate's full enough already.
She was a little more direct than that. In the book, I sanitized it. So, it was sort of the first deal of the bankruptcy. I had been reminded by one of my colleagues that Steve was going to retire at the end of the year from the bankruptcy court. And I knew I could not recommend him if he was going to jump ship in the middle of the case. We all thought the case would take years, and I knew I couldn't recommend him. So we had a very full, frank, and candid conversation, and I said, because I had canvassed my bench, the chief judge of the bankruptcy court had canvassed his bench, and Steve was, I wouldn't say the unanimous choice, but he was pretty close to the unanimous choice to recommend to Chief Judge Batchelder of the Court of Appeals, who was going to make the appointment. But I had to have this direct conversation with Steve. I said, Steve, I really can't recommend you if you're going to jump ship in the middle. And Steve said, I said, have you talked about this with Kathy, his wife? And have you thought about it? And he said, yes, I've thought about it. I've talked to Kathy. He said, I'm good to go on one condition. I said, what's that? I thought he was going to ask for support for the court and all the things that the district court can provide to the bankruptcy court. And he said that you be the chief judicial mediator. I'm usually pretty good at reading situations. I missed this one by a universe. This didn't come from left field. It came from somewhere in outer space. And it was just something I was definitely not expecting. But I always like a challenge. Mm-hmm. I was a competitive tennis and squash player, and I always like to get the ball with the game on the line. So I wanted to do it, but as Guy indicated, I had a lot of challenges. Both my dance card was full. Lori was not embracing this with a lot of enthusiasm. We had a 15-year-old son. I was teaching, I was lecturing, editing, running the court, and had my judicial docket and a few other things. Plus, my colleagues didn't embrace, some of my colleagues, not all of them by any means. Actually, the majority thought it was a good idea that I do it, but some of them, a vocal minority, thought it was not such a good idea. And some of them had good reasons. The appeals from the bankruptcy court would come to our court. As one of my colleagues put it, your colleagues are going to be in the position of deciding whether their chief judge had put together a legal viable deal. That could be awkward. Jerry, that could be awkward. And I certainly understood that.
Was it legally dubious at the time? Did you have some questions, not just ethically, but legally?
Well, I got some very good advice, Guy, from our ethics officer in the U.S. Court's office, administrative office. Got some very good advice. He encouraged me to do it, but he gave me some marks to hit to make sure I was protected, and anybody else who I would appoint as a mediator.
But I want to jump ahead to the story, which was when you were on the knife's edge, deciding whether or not to do this. It came down to your 15-year-old son.
Well,
I love this story because Jake is the unsung hero of the grand bargain.
Jake was 15. I was getting a lot of pushback from some of my colleagues, not a majority, but some. And, I had these personal issues that I had to contend with, and I had to worry about the court. So Jake and I were riding out early one morning to play golf, and Steve Rhodes called me, and he wanted to know if I was going to do it, because as he put it, if you're not going to do it, I've got to get somebody else to do it. And I told him I was, I didn't tell him about Lori, but I told him I was getting some pushback from some of my colleagues. I gave him some of the reasons. And Jake didn't say anything, but when we were riding home from playing golf, he looked at me very intently and he said, "So Dad, are you really thinking about not doing this bankruptcy thing?" I'm a Winston Churchill guy. I have been since my first year in college. And Jake's heard all the speeches and seen the black and white grainy films, knows all about my love and worship of Winston Churchill. And he looks at me very intently and he says, "What do you think Churchill would have done, Dad? Do you think Churchill would have refused? Everybody has a time to stand up. This is your time." So I came home and I told Lori, and she just said, "Okay." It was pretty remarkable. It just kind of crystallized, and I thought, Guy, only time and fortune will know whether this was my time to stand up. Mm-hmm. But Churchill certainly wouldn't have refused. So I called Steve and said, "I'm in."
So in means that you've got these folks that are looking at having to live on $13,000 a year instead of $19,000. These folks that are hoping that they can find a contract that they can live with. $6 billion in creditors from New York who have an axe to grind because they've got trillions on the line if they should
That was
lose.
just one bond family. It was actually much more.
Right. But so in all of that, the only asset that can be attached is this thing that is the jewel in the crown of Detroit. It's our heart in so many ways. And you're stuck with this dilemma about trying to make sure that these people, and you felt that the retirees had to be, in spite of maybe some of the legalistic stuff going on, needed morally and ethically to be first in line.
Well, I knew that they had contracts. They had pension contracts, but that contracts were impaired all the time in bankruptcy. That's what bankruptcy does. It's a sad fact, but even pension contracts are impaired.
But
and they thought that their pensions were guaranteed by the state constitution, but they weren't. And Steve Rhodes ultimately ruled that way. So I began to think of the bankruptcy as bookended by the pensions on one side, which was the only real asset the city had, and on the other side, the retirees, which were not only the most vulnerable of the creditors, but also they were the largest creditors. They also had the most political sway, a fact that I was not unaware of.
And I mean, there's the elephant in the room was the fact that we had Kevin Orr, who was appointed by a white guy in Lansing. We had a white bankruptcy judge. We had a white chief mediator in a city that is 89% black, with a majority group of pensioners who were people of color.
And Kevin was black, Kevin Orr, who was referred to by the retirees as Kevin Oreo.
They threw cookies at him.
They threw Oreo cookies at him. He had to have, first time I met him, he came in with a protective detail, and I thought, boy, that guy's kind of bigger than I looked. He was wearing a bulletproof vest.
So how worried were you, before we get to the doodle, how worried were you about the very real potential, 67 still looms in our memories, of civil unrest, because there was this feeling that a lot of white folks were going to determine the outcomes of the pensioners and the city itself for generations?
Well, in Detroit, those of us who have lived here for decades know that race was always lurking under the surface, no matter what the issue was, whether it was schools and cross-district busing, education, whatever it was, race was always lurking under the surface.
Well, if you're with Coleman Young, it wasn't under the surface
yeah,
at all.
And Coleman Young brought it up. So I was very much aware that race was going to be a big issue, and that any solution to the bankruptcy had to take this into account, plus the plight of the retirees. So what really happened was we had an asset, the DIA, that we really couldn't liquidate. It would have been, I felt, I'll I'll steal a line from Winston Churchill here. I felt that if we liquidated the DIA, we would be weighed in the balance by history and found wanting. And I just thought it was a terrible idea. And on the other hand, we had the retirees, but we also had the bondholders, and we haven't even talked about all there were 170,000 creditors. We haven't talked about all the vendors who were selling to Detroit, and Detroit needed them to continue to sell to them. So, and then the judgment creditors, and so all of this had to be, but I began to think of the bankruptcy as a distillation, on the one hand, of the DIA as the only true asset the city had, and on the other hand, the retirees. So, should I tell the story now of the
Doodle away.
Doodle away. So I was, at the very beginning of the bankruptcy, I was down in Florida with Jake. I had promised him a golf vacation. I was getting up very early. I'd taken all this reading with me that our court librarian had put together. And I was reading it, and then I was talking to all the lawyers, introducing myself, urging them to be collegial and collaborative and all this stuff. Every conversation with them ended with, what about the art? They were very focused on the art. So was Kevin and the city and the governor.
Christie's.
Exactly. He had hired Christie's auction house to appraise the value of the art, and that was just before the filing of the bankruptcy. So they were serious about it. Kevin now pretties this up and says it was a bluff, but believe me, it was not a bluff. He was dead serious about it. Kevin had gotten a email from one of his staff saying, "You weren't hired to save the art, and either was I. You were hired to save the city." And so it was quite stark. And I got up, I don't know, 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the morning, made myself a pot of coffee. I had been taking notes on a legal pad of my conversations with the lawyers that I was talking to, and there wasn't any paper left on the pad, but the cardboard backing was there. So I doodled this idea that I had, and the idea was to get the state to kickstart funding. So I put the state in a circle on one side, and to raise money, put the art in a trust. Then I put the art in a circle, and then I drew a square around it to indicate we were going to lock it off from all of the other creditors, and then use the trust to flow whatever money we were able to raise to give it to the retirees. And I put the pensions in another circle. I had dollar signs going from the state to the trust to the pensions. That was the concept. And then I thought of some questions. I realized it was a pretty crazy idea. And I wrote down a bunch of questions. How long would it take? How much did we need? What would it take to put the art in a public trust? Maybe it should be held by the state. And then I knew we wouldn't be able to raise enough just from the state. So at the bottom I wrote other sources. I wrote private parties, foundations, and the DIA. At the very beginning, I was already focused on, I thought that if the DIA was going to buy its freedom from Detroit's creditors, it should have some skin in the game. So at the end of the week, I put that doodle in with the rest of the reading, put it in my carry-on bag, got back in my chambers, took it out, put it in a pile behind my desk, and forgot about the doodle completely. I do a lot of doodles. I forgot about the doodle, but I didn't forget about the idea.
So you get to this point where, I mean, push is really coming to shove because you're not making a lot of progress on any of these fronts.
We had no money, nothing that could be monetized into money. So I was making zero progress.
Right.
It was all very collegial, but it was a big bunch of nothing.
Desperation started to make that doodle make sense.
Yes.
And so the idea of the foundations
Went to the governor first.
Okay, well, let's talk about the governor, because the governor is
An old friend of mine.
an old friend of yours, great guy.
Very-
Number of people in leadership in the Lansing, all good people. But
Very smart guy. Rick Snyder, you may remember, he ran on a campaign of one tough nerd.
Sure.
I knew he was a nerd because he had worked for me. I didn't know about the tough part. I didn't know how tough he'd be.
But bottom line, you got this idea of maybe extending an olive branch or extending just a feeler to
A
the
cup.
foundations.
Well, that was really born of necessity. I had 2 meetings with Governor Snyder, a couple more with his staff.
And it was direct.
Very direct. Finally, Dennis Muchmore, who was his chief of staff, said, "What part of no, with all due respect, you know what's coming next." He said, "With all due respect, Judge, what part of no don't you understand?"
And it was what
wasn't
part of
gonna
no
happen.
bailout do you not understand?
And remember, there was a conservative legislature in both houses, the Senate and the House, and Tea Party. The Tea Party was very strong, and the governor's staff acquainted me with the political realities of that, and they just kept saying it's not going to happen. Forget about it. So I ran into Miriam Nolan. Anybody here know Miriam? Miriam is a hero of this story. She's on the cover of the book, along with Jean. And I ran into her at the deli across the street from the courthouse, and she asked me how things were going. I said, not so good. We're all talking, and it's all very collegial, but we're not getting anywhere. And I said, but I've got an idea, and I'm wondering if you'd come over and talk with me about it. And so
She headed the community foundation?
She was head of the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. And I knew nothing about foundations. And I asked Eugene Dreiker, who I had appointed as one of my co-mediators. Any of you know Eugene? He's passed since, but he's another hero of the story here. And I asked Eugene to come with me, and I sort of spun out this idea, told her we weren't getting anywhere, needed to kickstart funding, told her we weren't getting anywhere with the governor, and I was wondering if the foundations might be interested in stepping in. And she looked at me, and she said, "How much do you know about foundations?" I said, "I know they have a lot of money for worthy causes, and Detroit's a worthy cause, and we need a lot of money." And she said, "Well, first, foundations don't work together. We each have our own mission silos." And she said, even with Katrina and 9/11, we didn't work together. And second, it sounds like you need a lot of money fast. Grant making in the foundation world is not fast. Even small grants can take a very, very long time. So, we kind of talked about it, and I said, I'm nothing if not persistent. I said, could you get your colleagues together to come to Detroit? I'll get all of my I had appointed a mediation team by this time of 6 mediators plus me. And I said, we'll give them the inside story and tell them about our idea. And she, good to her word, Miriam is a world-class problem solver. And she said she would. I got a list of all the foundation presidents, the email addresses of all the foundation presidents within a day. And I sent out an email that night, and within 14 minutes, this is unbelievable, my email pinged, and it was Darren Walker, who'd been the president of the Ford Foundation for about a month. And he said he would come November 5th. And my email started pinging, and all of them followed on. Obviously, they had been talking, and they were all coming on November 5th. And on November 5th, we had a meeting with all of the foundation heads.
So how did you,
At the courthouse.
And all these people would agree that they were siloed, that their mission statements and their missions didn't really align with what you were trying to do here.
And one other thing that I heard repeatedly from them, we solve problems for the future. We don't fix problems of the past.
Right, and we also had this horrible reputation of being in Detroit. Remember Ross Perot talked about the giant sucking sound?
Right.
Well, we were kind of, financially speaking, the giant sucking sound where good money followed, bad. So how did you convince them at this dinner that to A, get out of their silos, B, supercharge whatever they were going to do, and also accept the idea that this was a bet worth making, even though it wasn't necessarily in their wheelhouse?
So it was a process. I thought the meeting started at 4 o'clock in our conference center in the courtroom, in the courthouse. I thought the meeting would take an hour or an hour and a half. In fact, Miriam had planned a dinner at her house for after the meeting, and she asked me how long it would take. I said, can't imagine that we won't be done by 5:30 or 6. So she obviously told her caterer this. And we started talking. I made a presentation, and I talked about, I had gotten up early and roughed out my opening statement, and I had completely forgotten about what Miriam had told me, that foundations don't work together. So I ad-libbed. I did what every good lawyer does. You conform your opening statement to the evidence. So I made some notes on my agenda, and I said that I heard 3 missions in the room amongst the foundations, because I had asked them all to talk about their foundations and what their missions were. I said I heard 3 missions: the revitalization of urban centers, the cultural life, and funding the future. And I kind of glommed all that together and talked about how Detroit brought together all 3 of those missions. And I wish I had a transcript of what I said, but I don't. And I tossed away the opening statement I had written, so I don't really have a good record of it. But it sparked a conversation. And people got very engaged, and all of a sudden there were these side conversations going on. And I had asked all of my mediators were there, my team, and we all talked about our different lanes that we were mediating in. And it was just we were still going at 7:30. And I wanted this to be, I had written all over the agenda, confidential, don't tell anybody. I had said it in the email, and it had leaked to the media. So John Gallagher and Mark Stryker had camped out outside our courthouse. It was a cold, rainy night.
And by this time, it's being called the Art Trust, right?
Internally.
Yeah,
because
you're calling it the Art Trust.
We're calling it an Art Trust, yeah. And I was kind of, when the marshals told me that the reporters were outside, I was kind of happy it was cold and raining. So, this meeting ended up taking until almost 8 o'clock because people got so engaged, and then we went to Miriam's house afterward and continued the conversation with some of the foundation presidents. Darren Walker was there, Alberto Ibergarin from the Knight Foundation, Miriam, of course, Bill White from the Mott Foundation. And Rip wasn't there. Rip was out of town, unfortunately.
Okay.
Although Rip became a major player, my good friend, doubles partner from Washington in the 70s, president of the Kresge Foundation. But people just got very engaged about it. So that was November 5th. It was also the day that Mike Duggan was elected mayor. And so we all thought that was very good. And we couldn't stop talking about it. It was like we couldn't let go of each other. The dinner didn't end until 12:30. And so there's a story, I don't know if it's true. I still don't really believe it. But Alberto Ibergarin and Darren Walker swear it's true that on the cab ride back to their hotel, they both agreed that Darren agreed he'd do $100 million and the Knight Foundation would do $20 million. Nobody ever told me that. But over the next month or so, I was talking to them consistently. I met with Darren a week later. The story then broke. The Detroit News broke the story,
right?
Which really upset me, because I was afraid that the foundations would get cold feet, and particularly the bond creditors. I was taking the only asset and monetizing it, giving it all to one creditor group.
So how problematic was that? Because you
I
risk
thought it was
angering these folks and these folks, and
I thought it was very problematic. I was very worried about it.
But you thought it cleared the runway to some degree. for everything else.
As it turned out, it's not what I thought at the time. I thought it was very problematic because I thought that the foundations would get cold feet because there'd be all this adverse publicity from all the other creditors who were not going to get a piece of the value of the art. But as it turned out, it really, once it became public, it just kind of sparked people's imagination. And then John Gallagher at the Free Press a week later wrote an article, and he called me for background before he wrote it. And he said, we were calling it the Art Trust. And John, and I was explaining to him how I thought if we could get the retirees off the creditor runway and raise some money, that this would animate a solution to the bankruptcy. And John said, so this is kind of like a grand bargain, huh? And, you know, that was meaningless to me at the time. There had just been a grand bargain between President Obama and Speaker Boehner over the budget and taxes, and it blew up with lots of finger pointing and recriminations. So I just said kind of, well, I hope this one ends up better than the next. But the next day, John wrote an article, the headline article in the Free Press, talked about a grand bargain that I was putting together. And my email pinged at about, 10:30 in the morning. I'm sitting at my desk, and I get this email from this guy. I'd never heard of him. Some of you may know him. I'd never heard of him. And the email said, everything that my wife and I have ever had, we owe to Detroit. We love the DIA, and we want to start the bidding with $5 million. I thought it was one of these...
Just a private citizen.
Private citizen. I thought it was one of these offshore emails, you know, that want your...
And all you got to do is send $5 million to us, right?
So he had his phone number in the email, and I called him. We had this wonderful conversation. I don't know if any of you are espionage fans or read espionage novels, but I have some friends in the espionage world, and they often get emails from people who want to provide information and cooperate. They call them virtual walk-ins, or VWs. So this was Paul Scott, my virtual walk-in. We had lunch the next day at the DAC, and turns out he was a chemistry professor at Wayne State University who had invented a firefly gene that lit up diseased molecules. And he was explaining this to me. I told him, you know, I can tell you in 2 words why I went to law school, organic chemistry. He said, it's not that interesting anyway. But he formed a biotech company, sold it for $275 million. And so here's this very gentle, self-effacing chemistry professor. All he wants to do is help his city. And I'm spending every single day what I called the Shark Tank with some of the toughest lawyers and financial people in the world who wanted to take apart my city. And having lunch with Paul was a tonic. It was just, I immediately went back and called Eugene Dreiker and wrote an email to all of my mediator colleagues and told them about this. It was just a spark that we needed.
So he was a spark. The dinner at Miriam's was a spark. There was supposedly the cab ride that may or may not be true, but it's a great apocryphal story.
It is. The $100 million cab
But in
ride.
the end, these foundations stepped up.
They did.
With almost, 350?
Let me tell you how it happened. So the meeting was November 5th. December 9th, just a month later, I came back into my chambers and my admin, Donna, called in and said, Darren Walker's on the phone for you. So Darren, president of the Ford Foundation, comes on, and his voice is just ebullient, and he says, Judge, we are inspired by your idea. My board has just voted to make the largest single commitment in the Ford Foundation's history. I had no idea how much that was, and I kind of didn't want to ask. You know, there's something impolite about it. So Darren went on, and he said, you're probably wondering how much. And I said, well, I'm interested. And he said, the Ford Foundation will commit $125 million. And I said the first thing that came to my mind, which was, Darren, when the history of this book is written, you will be the hero. And he is, there's actually a bunch of other heroes, but Darren is front and center.
We should point out the Ford Foundation at that point had very little to do with the Ford family.
Nothing to do with the
Henry
Ford family.
Ford II kind of cut all ties, didn't he?
He cut all ties, and they'd moved out of Detroit.
Right, and it was over the fact that they weren't giving enough money to his own foundation, wasn't giving enough money to the city of Detroit. So
Right.
the judge manages to reverse this decades in the making estrangement.
Well, we had several conversations, in fact, one when I was in New York. And Darren was telling me that one of his objectives was to reconnect Ford to Detroit and to the Ford Foundation, which was music to my ears. I said, you know, there's no better way to do that
So
than to step in.
other foundations begin falling in line, but they all have one thing in common.
They had a condition.
Well, wait a minute, I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
But didn't they all give record amounts?
They all gave, Darren told me, he said, you're going to be hearing from all of my colleagues, and you will hear from every one of them. They are going to make the largest contribution in their history, the largest grant in their history. And I thought that was just remarkable. So I started hearing from all of the different foundations. And that was on a Monday, December 9th. And by Wednesday afternoon, I had $291 million. Rip Rapson called me from Paris, and the Kresge Foundation contributed $100 million. And I just started getting these calls, and I still had 4 or 5 remaining to hear from. And I called Eugene Dreicher, and I said, it's time to go back and see the governor.
Because
So-
there was a condition applied. The one thing that all these foundations, who were being really the soul of generosity,
Yeah.
but they did say, we need to see the state of Michigan have some skin in the game. The same state of Michigan that said to you, what part of no bailout do you not understand?
So I knew that this was a condition, and they were very serious about it because they felt that if the state was not going to be a significant stakeholder, that the foundations didn't want to have any part of it. And not just the state, the DIA. That was a condition too, because we were buying the DIA's freedom from Detroit's creditors. So I called the governor's scheduler. I said, we have to get on the governor's schedule as soon as possible. So she set up, this was a Wednesday afternoon, she set up a meeting with the governor for Friday morning, and Eugene and I drove up there, and we had kind of rehearsed what we were going to say, or what I was going to say, I guess. And we get in Rick's office, and there was a semicircle of all of us. There was Eugene, and the governor was sitting where Guy is sitting next to me. Dick Posthumus, you guys remember? Dick was lieutenant governor. At one point, he was the Senate Majority Leader.
John Engler.
For John Engler. And also, he was now, at this point, he was Governor Snyder's legislative liaison guy, the guy who was going to have to sell this to the legislature. Not easy. It was a Republican, conservative, Tea Party legislature. And, you know, he was part of the No Bailout for Detroit group in the governor's office. So we get there and we start the conversation. Rick Snyder says, how are things going? And I said, well, as you know, we have no assets and nothing to give creditors, so we're not making very much progress on getting agreements. But you've read that I have this idea to leverage the art to raise money to give to the retirees. And he said, how's that going? So I had started keeping a tally sheet of the contributions. And
he's really good with numbers.
Yeah, I was going to get to 291 million. I was going to go through them all. So Rick says, so how's it going? So how are you coming? I opened my portfolio and I have my little tally sheet. And I started off with the showstopper. I said, The Ford Foundation has committed $125 million. And you may remember Rick has kind of a high-pitched voice. He says, "Really?" Just like that. And I quickly followed up and I said, "And Kresge has committed $100 million." He said, "Really?" So we rolled it out, and I was going to trot it out with a little fanfare to $291 million. But remember, Rick's an accountant. And he says, "So you're at $291 million," before I could even say that. So I said, "Right." I said, we've got 4 or 5 or 6 foundations who are still out there. He said, "So how much do you think you're going to get to?" I said, "I think we're going to get to about 350 million, maybe a little more." So I said, "But Rick, I have to tell you, all of these commitments are conditional on the state being a substantial participant." He said, "So tell me about this." And I said, "Rick," I had this whole speech prepared. I said, "Rick, you and I both know." I had gotten permission to share the numbers from the foundations, but they were state secrets, closely held secrets. And I said, "You and I both know that invariably all of these numbers are going to become public. This is an assetless bankruptcy. We can't leave this money on the sidelines. If we do, we will all be weighed by history in the balance and found wanting." He nodded. So I said, "You know, you made a very courageous decision to put the city into bankruptcy. It was a decision that all of your predecessors had avoided, kicked down the road, and swept under the rug. But you can't throw up your hands now and say, 'Not my problem.'" And he said, "So what are you asking?" I said, "I think you've got to match the foundations." And he said, "You know, this is going to be very difficult to get. We'll have to go to the legislature." He said, "This is going to be very difficult." He said, "We're only going to get one shot at this. You can't come back and say it's not enough. You can't retrade me." And I said, I understand that. And then, you know, he asked the ultimate question, which was, "Do you think it'll be enough?" Because if we get the money from the foundations and the money from the state, if it's not going to be the solution to the bankruptcy, you might as well not have it.
Because these folks still have to approve it.
Everybody's got to
These
approve
folks
it.
still have to approve it.
The legislature has to approve it. And Rick says, "Do you think it'll be enough?" I remember vividly looking at Eugene Dreiker, who was sitting right about there. He looked kind of like Yoda. He's kind of wispy gray hair, and he's sitting there like this, and he's just nodding his head, you know, "Say yes." Because we could see that the governor was coming our way. I'm also looking at Dick Posthumus, who was sitting right about there, and Dick was turning pale. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. And I said, "Rick, if we get 350 from the foundations and 350 from the state, we're still going to need more. Maybe the DIA, other private parties, but we'll make it work." And he reached over, we shook hands, and he said, "This will be a partnership." If you know one thing about Rick Snyder, if he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. He's going to do it. And we shook hands, and we all had other things to get to. I stood up, we started walking out. Dick Posthumus comes over, he puts his arm around me, and he says, "Jerry, I've known you for a long time, but you have no idea how hard this is going to be." And he pointed at Rick, and he said, "And either does he." And I said, "We don't have an option, Dick." I said, "I don't have a plan B." I said, "I'll meet with every legislator, every one, but we don't have an option. This has to work." So for me, I did. Eugene Dreiker and I met with every single legislator. We met with the Speaker of the House. We met with the chairman of the committee in both the House and the Senate. And for me, one of the most emotional moments in the bankruptcy was when we went up for Senate consideration of what was called by this time the grand bargain legislation. The term grand bargain took on a life of its own. It proved the advertising the advertising adage to sell something, you got to have a a label for it. But the grand bargain legislation was being considered in the Senate, and I will never forget this. Tom Casperson, a state senator from the Upper Peninsula, very conservative, but very, very well respected. He was a business guy, stood up. The Senate went silent. Tom stood up, he took the microphone, and he said, "Today we are all Detroiters." Tears came to my eyes. And the legislation in both the House and the Senate, against all odds, passed overwhelmingly. So we had $350 million from the state.
But they also did something, and I don't think they were necessarily forcing you into a corner on this, but there was the notion and it wasn't just Republicans either, it was some Democrats too that said, we have to be able to go back to our constituents and say that we just didn't toss money down a rat hole.
Right. So we had to have a financial review commission.
How important was that? I mean,
it was absolutely critical.
Were you going to do that anyway? Was that?
Well, yes, because I brought in Dick Ravitch from New York, and Dick had been the advisor in the New York, when New York almost went bankrupt in 1975. And he said, you have to have a review commission to make sure that Detroit doesn't go back to its old ways.
And that has proven to be pivotal.
It was pivotal. And we put a financial review commission in, and it was chaired by Bill Martin. And Detroit hit every single one of its marks for 8 years. Every mark. It was almost miraculous.
We need to get to some questions and answers here, so we'll cut to the chase.
We've only got two of the legs of the grand bargain.
I know, but you got
we
the
need
bond.
to get to the third.
You got to the bondholders, which read the book because there's a very interesting meeting that takes place in the barber shop of the Federal District Courthouse, which is
no, it wasn't the courthouse.
The courthouse?
It was a tiny little barber shop in the Ford building, and that became known. We did one of the most important deals there, with just the lead lawyer for the city and the lead negotiator for one of the bond families. It became known as the haircut at the haircut.
But you got the retirees to approve it, which was no small feat because there were people that, and I've got two questions of my own that I want to ask, but you got the bondholders, then you got the collective bargaining agreement.
We got to get to
Gene. And you got the DIA, which was no small thing to come up to their contributors, their donors, to say, we need you to pony up yet again.
So this is one of the most important stories.
But I can tell you, I'm getting a rap. You know this in television?
Who are you getting the rap from?
I'm not going to say. I protect all my sources.
I'm going to overrule them.
Oh, okay.
Because this is one of the most important stories in the bankruptcy. The foundations and the state was requiring the DIA to have skin in the game. So Eugene Dreiker and I dipped our toe in the negotiating waters with Gene Gargaro. And the DIA had committed. They had just gotten the millage the year before the bankruptcy approved, and they had made a pledge that they wouldn't come back and ask for a renewal. So they were raising money to do that. So I knew this was going to be very, very difficult to get money from the DIA. But we started talking to Gene, and if any of you know Gene Gargaro, Gene, stand up, please. Stand up again. Gene is a can-do kind of guy and always very positive. I call him St. Gene. And we started negotiating. I think his first offer was $10 million. Then he got to $20 million, then $25 million. And every time he would tell me that, it was very pained. And he finally got to $50 million, and he said, I have no idea if we can do this, but we will try. And I knew that probably wasn't going to be enough. But I called the governor, and I said, Gene Gargaro has said he's going to try to get $50 million. And the governor said, not sure that's going to be enough, but I'm going to Washington at the end of the month to speak to getting an award from a group called the Americans for Art, and I'm going to ask Gene to go with me. So I said, great, anything you can do to help. So the night before he was going to Washington, my BlackBerry lights up with Rick on it, and he says, guess what I've been doing for the last 2 hours? I said, I don't know, Rick, what? He said, remember, he's an accountant. He said, I've got the DIA's audited financials. I can save them $5 to $6 million a year. I said, okay. And then he dove into this accountant speak, which his aides and I called dolphin speak, because totally, and he gets all excited about it, but he starts talking about it. And I said, great, Rick, what are you going to do with that? And Lori's sitting in the chair next to me. And he said, I'm going to ask Gene for $100 million tomorrow. I said, Rick, get the award first. So the next morning, he calls me, and his voice is ebullient, and he said, I had a very productive breakfast with Gene Gargaro this morning. I said, how productive? He said, I got you $100 million. I said, really? He said, yeah. So my first instinct was to call Gene, because even smart people like the governor hear what they want to hear and disregard the rest, like Paul Simon said in The Boxer. So I waited for Gene to call me. He calls me, and he says, I said, how was your breakfast with the governor? He said, that was the most expensive breakfast in history. He said, I had no idea how I was going to get to 50 million, and I sure don't know how I'm going to get to 100 million, but we're going to try. And you raised $100 million in how long, Gene?
10 months.
10 months. And that was the grand bargain. We raised $830 million. We took that money, gave it all to the retirees, and we bought the city a 10-year holiday from making pension contributions. And with the money that was saved, we used that to get deals and to fund many other things and set the foundation for Detroit's recovery.
Street lights, new
ambulances, fire trucks, police cars, and that's really how it worked. And the book is about much more than just those three deals with the retirees
But it's full of characters, fascinating characters. And I got to ask you, so there's not, can I just really, I hate to put it too fine a point here, over 350 pages, and there's not one asshole in the entire book. Now, I got to say, not putting too fine a point on it, and I apologize for using that, but in nearly 50 years of news gathering,
there's always a villain.
there's usually many people that are more interested in feathering their own nest, more interested in playing to the media and pontificating. Did you leave them out by choice, or was this some kind of miracle?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
So if I could, I'm sorry, did you
Well,
have
my
another?
next question, and it's my final question.
Reporters always have questions.
That's right. And it's this. Though, throughout the book, there are people that put Detroit's interests first, that put their own self-interest aside, in many cases their own political self-interest up in Lansing.
And made sacrifices.
They made sacrifices. They were willing to take the heat. Could this be done today?
That's a great question. I'd like to say yes, but I'm not so sure, because politicians today seem to have discovered that the profit is in dividing us. It's where the money is. It's on the far right, it's on the far left, and the politicians in both parties play to that. But I'd like to, I'm not a politician, so I'd like to just read a 3-minute and 20-second segment of the book, because I think it answers your question.
Okay.
I wrote this more than 10 years ago on the plane to Washington. I wrote the introduction. This is the last 3 paragraphs of the introduction. So I hope it kind of sums it up. The introduction is called Detroit's Big Bang Theory, for reasons I hope will be obvious. This book is not so much a story about the tick-tock of a bankruptcy case as it is about the collective heart of the people who made all of this possible in less than 16 months, warp speed in the highly contentious municipal bankruptcy world. It's often said that a successful story must have heroes and villains. There are many heroes and heroines in this book, but there are no villains. Although there was certainly intense conflict, high tension, deep antagonisms and misjudgments, this is instead the story of the dozens of enormously bright, talented, creative, courageous, and incredibly dedicated men and women, the political and community leaders, lawyers and judges, retirees, financial experts, union leaders and their members, business leaders, financial creditors, and visionary philanthropic leaders, all of whom stepped forward together, many at great personal risk and sacrifice, to overcome doubt, distrust, cynicism, rigidity, self-interest, and the ghosts of the city's past failures, to piece together a universally agreed-upon plan to rescue and give rebirth to an iconic American original. In a public square filled with pessimism, we found helping hands. In an era of cynicism, partisan dysfunctionality, self-interest, and civic irresponsibility, we found allies among people with good hearts, hard-headed common sense, and uncommon courage. We learned that even in a time of political polarization, with trust in each other, Americans can still find common ground for the greater good. All of us planted a flag together on that common ground and walked away from our work with the hope that others might see it and follow its example. In the end, that's why I decided to write this book, the first telling from the inside of how Detroit was rescued from the brink of oblivion. It's a cautionary tale, but also an inspiring one. In this drama, Americans of all backgrounds come together to reaffirm our heritage of good citizenship and to offer hope to all American cities facing similar challenges. In short, this is the story of Detroit's own Big Bang Theory, of unrelated people and events colliding together by chance in the same time and space to create a universe of new hope and opportunity for a great city and its people. By a quirk of fate, I was privileged to be with this small group of extraordinary people at the center of the vortex of this Big Bang. This is the story of those people and the events that consumed them. I hope this story will resonate in every corner of our country where faith in democratic government and civil discourse is flickering.
So if you have someone that you love that loves Detroit, make it a gift to them, because it is a restorative and it is inspirational, and it is a great tonic.
I'm supposed to say where you can find the book online. My publisher's out there, and he'd kill me if I don't. Yeah, there he is. You can get it at either Amazon or grandbargainbook.com. And also, please, if you read the book, write a review on Amazon. The reviews really do help.
So, some wonderful questions, and we're going to get to a couple of them, and if some of you have questions, you can go to the mic in the back. But the first one is an update, if you will, on how Detroit's doing in regards to the city service delivery. Are the streetlights lit? We should point out that the mayor of the city, if I'm not mistaken, engaged in a partnership with Detroit Edison,
Yes.
DTE, within a few months of becoming mayor. And yes, the street lights are on.
All 90,000. More than 40% were out at the beginning of the bankruptcy. All 90,000 are out, and they're not wired with copper anymore. I think they're mercury vapor.
Right, but
So
it's
they can't be
aluminum lines.
Aluminum lines. They can't be scavenged.
Yeah. Do fire stations have alarm systems?
Yes.
Yes, they do. They are hardwired.
And not only alarm systems, they have fire trucks and ambulances now.
This is off topic, but I'll get to it in a moment. And this is a question I think many of us might have. Judge, with Mayor Duggan leaving, what guardrails are in place to prevent unchecked spending? Is the Financial Review Board still active?
It is not currently active, but it can be reignited. if Detroit starts to miss its marks.
But Mike Duggan has been so incredibly perceptive in putting best practices
Yes.
into place. How worried are you that there is a shelf life to that? And if you look, because I'm worried about the current crop of candidates
I am too.
that I see.
You know, it's always about political will, Guy. And one of the things we had in the Detroit bankruptcy, whether it was the governor, Kevin Orr, state leadership in both parties, we had political will to see the bankruptcy through. If the next core of leadership in the city doesn't have political will, I fear for what's going to happen. And political will means making tough decisions, saying no to a lot of the boondoggle spending that had been done for decades in Detroit.
Well, and we should point out one of the final little conditions that the legislature put on the grand bargain money, and the grand bargain legislation, was they wanted the unions to kick in some money.
Yeah.
And it's still hard for the elected leadership in the city of Detroit to say no to its own unions.
It is. And that's one of the things that led to the pension funding crisis.
Any other questions regarding the grand bargain from any of you? Sir?
Who owns the assets of the DIA? Is it the city?
It's in a public trust.
So the city does not own it?
City does not own it anymore. Gene, do you want to speak to that a little more? You might be able to.
You just said it very well.
It's in a public trust. We put it in a public trust. So this idea that I had,
Did the city ever own the assets?
yes, the city owned the assets.
So how did you avoid liquidation of those assets?
We took it and transferred it. We impaired the contracts and put it in a public trust.
Any other questions?
The public trust document's about that thick, by the way. So what started off on the backing of a legal pad, cardboard backing of a legal pad, is now about that thick.
Is that where it will stay?
Yes,
So the artwork is protected.
the art is protected.
Jerry,
Yes,
tell them where the doodle hangs.
I was just
maybe. So I told you I had put the doodle in this stack of reading, right? And forgotten about it for about 6 months. And Gene was coming in for lunch, but I was in my office cleaning up, and I found this doodle and put it on my desk to show to Gene. When he came in, I showed it to Gene, and he said, "That's got to hang in the DIA." And that's where it's hanging, in the DIA.
Yes.
Judge, are you going to help with other bankruptcies that occur throughout the country? Are you going to be recruited by some of your colleagues that help Detroit?
You know, I consulted a little bit on Puerto Rico, and it was interesting and sad because there's no political will there. And just taking one city as an example, Chicago. Chicago's pensions are $65 billion in underfunding. And there's no political will to change it. Instead, they just keep raising taxes, and Chicago is now losing population. So that death spiral that started in Detroit in the 50s and 60s is now starting in Chicago. Some of you may be familiar with San Francisco and the challenges there. They're going through the same thing. There's no political will in these cities to make hard decisions.
Well, the CalPERS fund.
The CalPERS fund is,
And
I don't
the
know,
state of
250
California.
billion or
Yeah.
something underfunded.
Same with Los Angeles?
Cities around, I don't know what LA's is, but cities around LA. There were, at any given time, there were 4 or 5 cities in California that are in bankruptcy. It takes political will, and it's hard to say no,
And good people.
and good people.
Thank you so very, very much. On behalf of each of us here, we can't thank you enough for being here, for enriching our lives tonight, and for having this wonderful conversation. And for those of you who are still here, there are books and beverages available for purchase. Those of you who have this, if this is your first time to the club and you are interested in learning more about membership, talk to anybody with a badge. or there's a membership desk outside to the right as you walk down the stairs. Thank you again so very much for being here. Drive safely and good night.